Hi, welcome to our next segment. We are still talking about high Renaissance painting in Italy, but we're going to be talking specifically about the work of Michaelangelo, who was another sort of Renaissance superstar during this period. Not only did he deal with painting, but he also dealt with sculpture. What I'm showing you right now is a quote from Michaelangelo. And I'm not going to read it. I'll let you take the time to read through it. But basically, there's a paragon and a debate over the relative merits of sculpture versus painting. Leonardo, who we studied in our last segment, was really into painting and a proponent for that. And Michelangelo really thought sculpture was sort of the more refined art medium to be using as an artist. And Michelangelo was a very great painter, but I think he enjoyed sculpture more. Unfortunately, the College Board does not really discuss much of they don't really have any of his sculptures as part of their list of 250 works that you have to know in their curriculum. But it is important that we do talk about the sculpture of Michelangelo, because his sculpture is really, you have to understand it to really understand and appreciate the painting that he did in the Sistine Chapel, which is what you do have to know. So this is an example of one of his sculptures, one of his first sculptures. Michelangelo's father had been a stone carver. This sculpture was his first public sculpture and was originally commissioned by a French cardinal for his tomb. The subject of the Pietà, which we have seen before, was not common in Italy during this time. We saw a Pietà when we were looking at the Gothic period in Germany, and I'll bring up a slide of that in just a second. It was actually more popular in France, and this was this commission that he received was a very powerful start to his career. So, like with many of the paintings that we've talked about with Raphael and Leonardo, again, note the pyramidal composition. Even though we're looking at a three-dimensional sculpture, it still has that sort of triangular shape that is very balanced. And again, it really gives the sculpture stability and weight. Here is the earlier image that we looked at during our exploration of Gothic art. We looked at mostly Gothic architecture in France, and then we did look at some Gothic sculpture in Germany. And if you remember, the Gothic sculpture in Germany was very expressive and very emotional. And this is the Rodigan Pietà. And again, I want to remind you that the Pietà is a composition that has the Virgin Mary with her adult son Jesus in her lap after he's been crucified. And so this is on your list of AP works that you do have to know, but I think it's good for you to understand Michelangelo's sculpture as well. Some things to note when we look more intensely at the sculpture. The Virgin is idealized and portrayed very young. For Michelangelo, the body was the sole means of expression. So this goes back to, again, this idea of Greek classical art and the Renaissance sort of being born out of those ideas. For him, purity equaled youth, which is, in essence, innocence. And so that is the reasoning behind why he portrayed the Virgin very young, because obviously if she was holding the adult Jesus, she would not be a young woman. But this idea of youth and innocence and is something that he was trying to express. When we get in closer, her facial expression is very calm, and it isn't sort of the typical face of grief. She has more of a nobility and sort of a serene expression. And again, here's a better view of her face. When we look at other parts of the composition, notice the contrast of this sort of undulating drapery and the smooth flesh. And that's something he did a lot of in a lot of his sculpture, where he would sort of show off how well he could fabricate skin in marble, and then also this sort of texture, this beautiful sort of undulating, almost wet style, wet drapery style fabric and sort of compare and contrast the two textures. The notion is that he has displaced the grief from the face of the Virgin. So again, she's not showing grief, and has sort of put it into the folds of the garment. And so the garment definitely is much more expressive and emotional and has a lot more energy. And so that's what some art historians have put forth. The juxtaposition also emphasizes Christ's dead weight. When we look at the figure, he really has conveyed that idea, and that in fact Christ, didn't mean to go do that. You really get a sense of the weight and gravity of the figure, and that he is sort of slumped and isn't in fact dead. And so she's kind of having to sort of balance this dead weight while she holds the figure in her lap. And so the figure of Mary is basically presenting the figure of Jesus to us, the viewer. The arm of the figure of Christ shows a careful study of anatomy. I mean, really look at the veins and the articulation of the muscle. And what we'll see happening is that people love this sculpture, and it will actually inspire future artists who will actually sort of reference this arm, this magnificent arm that that Michelangelo sculpted. Michelangelo has been described as a hermit who kept to himself, so he wasn't the most social figure. He was unknown at the time he created this sculpture, and he ended up signing the work across the banner here that the Virgin wears across her chest after he completed this sculpture. And actually what he did was that he was sort of upset that no one would know or give him credit. I mean, they were giving him credit, but wouldn't know that he had done it. And so he kind of went in after he sculpted it and signed it. And then he has been quoted as regretting having done that. Something else I wanted to point out, going back to the full composition in reference to the pyramidal form that we're talking about, you might also note that the scale and the proportions are a little bit off, that the lap of the Virgin Mary is huge. This is not anatomically correct, but it for some reason when we look at the piece, it doesn't bother us. It looks okay, and in part, he again sort of exaggerated her lap and made it larger so she could sort of display this body of the figure of the dead Jesus, and so that's something else to note as well. Another figure that he sculpted, and this is probably one of the most famous sculptures by Michelangelo, is the figure of David. It's an over life-size sculpture. He used a subtractive method when he carved the marble, so he actually cut away from a block of marble. So he basically would start with a massive block of stone and would chisel and remove the excess stone. During this period, there was a 1,500-pound block of marble known as the Giant. The previous artist who had worked on it in the 1440s made a mistake, and it was believed that the block of stone was unusable. The block of stone was later pulled out, and a competition was held to see if any sculptor could make do with the flawed block of marble. Also, to put this statue in context as well, you need to remember that Florence was constantly under attack, and historically had managed to overcome these threats. So remember, these Italian city-states are still sort of rivaling and fighting amongst each other. The figure of David was very important, and the city of Florence already associated itself with this figure. I hope you remember, because we actually looked at an early Renaissance bronze statue, which I will show you in a bit to compare and contrast. But the figure of David, it was sort of seen as the underdog, and he defeated this huge giant. And the city of Florence was being bullied by Milan and the Duke of Milan. And anyway, the Duke of Milan ended up dying, and the city of Florence thought that this was a sign from God. and try to help them out. And so, Florence was sort of seen as the underdog, or this David that prevailed. And so that's why the figure of David is a very important civic symbolism. So the one by Donatello is the one that we did study when we looked at early Renaissance sculpture. And this is a bronze statue. And so compare and contrast the two statues for a second. Hopefully some things that you might have noticed is that Michelangelo's David is older. He's not depicted as a pubescent adolescent in the way that Donatello's is, and he carries no sword. And he also lacks some of the accoutrements, such as the hat and the boots, that I think made Donatello's image a lot more, seem more erotic. Even though he's more clothed than this figure, to me this figure seems definitely much more erotic. And again, very serpentine sort of shape, where this is definitely much classical, much more classical. This is classical, but this is definitely more referencing the high classical period during the ancient Greek historical period in art. Here's some additional views so that you can appreciate the sculpture in the round. One of the issues we have when we look at slides and images is that especially with three-dimensional art, it's really hard to get a sense of the space. Michelangelo is depicted. The moment is also different in the between the two. Michelangelo depicts the moment before David kills the great giant Goliath. So when we look at Donatello's, it's after he's already killed Goliath, and he's sort of standing on his head, his severed head. The figure of Michelangelo is standing in a relaxed contrapposto position. So again, hopefully try to use that term, try to use your vocabulary, contrapposto, which is that sort of shift, or that sort of shift where one part of the body is relaxed and the other part of the body is tense. And so David is relaxed, but he's also preparing for battle. And again, you can hear some other views. Notice the tense expression on his face. Here's a better one. And so he's really, this sort of intense expression. And this is something that Michelangelo became known for, this sort of tense expression that he often incorporated into many of his sculptural figures. He did one of Moses that we'll look at briefly, and there's actually a term that I'll talk to you about in just a second. Again, and so his tense here, this is a better idea, a better view of it, and his tense expression is meant to contrast with the figure's relaxed pose. So while the body is relaxed, his face is tense and alert and, trying to prepare and get ready to battle this giant. And there's a term, it's called terrobilita, and it basically is noting this sort of tense expression that Michelangelo often incorporated into his figures. Something else, too, obviously Michelangelo was inspired by Donatello, is his hairstyle, which is very different. This wasn't a typical Renaissance hairstyle. It actually looks like a mullet, which was not a hairstyle during the Renaissance. And some scholars believe that Michelangelo is referencing Donatello's sculpture, which was called the Marzico, or Marzicoco, which was also another civic symbol of pride in Florence. And so I think you can sort of see where he might have gotten this idea of the mane of the lion. And definitely it looks very similar to the curls in the hairstyle of David. Just to give you a little background, the lion is actually seated, and he has one paw and supports the coat of arms of Florence, which was the fleur-de-lis. So again, this idea of the mane, like a lion's mane, sort of framing this tense expression of the face of of David, I think, is very appropriate. That he's he's a lion. He's about to attack. The sculpture of David would come to symbolize Michelangelo's personal identity. And so this is the quote in Italian, and it translates, "David with his sling and I with my bow." And this bow that he's referencing is this is actually a sculptor's drill, which looks very similar to a bow. And so this is a tool that Michelangelo would most likely have used. And so Michelangelo is basically, showing off what he was able to do with this giant, unworkable marble that no one could do anything with, and actually conquered it. So in many ways, the symbol of David also was sort of a personal symbol in terms of Michelangelo's identity. And yes, so Michelangelo was able to take that 1,500-pound block of marble that was considered unusable and actually sculpted this statue of David from it. This is another sculpture that Michelangelo did of the figure of Moses. It was supposed to be part of a larger installation of sculptures that was supposed to be for the tomb of Julius II. And Michelangelo really was enjoying and really wanted to finish this tomb. It was supposed to be very grand and very massive. However, the Pope ran out of money to complete it. And so to sort of distract Michelangelo, he ended up giving him the commission to paint the interior of the Sistine Chapel, which Michelangelo did not want to do. He hated the idea of it. He would have much rather have spent his time finishing this sculpture for the tomb of Julius II. After the Pope's death in 1513, the scale of the project was reduced step by step until in April 1532, a final contract specified a simple wall tomb with fewer than 1/3 of the figures originally planned. So this was a kind of defeat for Michelangelo. So now what we're looking at is the exterior view of the Sistine Chapel. The chapel serves as a place, this is located in the Vatican City. It serves as a place of both religious and functionary papal activity. Today it is the site of the papal conclave, which is the process by which a new pope is selected. The fame of the Sistine Chapel lies mainly in the frescoes that decorate the interior, most particularly the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and the Last Judgment done by Michelangelo. So we're going to be traveling and sort of looking into the interior. So after running out of money for his tomb, Pope Julius II decided to get Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel instead. And again, Michelangelo was furious and fuming, and he hated this idea and did not want to do it. The ceiling is painting using fresco. So remember, fresco is wet plaster with pigment laid on top. The evidence of the plaster laid for a day's work can be seen around the head. Sorry, my notes are a little off. We'll talk about that. But this is done with fresco paint. A fable that you might have heard in reference to Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel was that he had to lie on his back to paint it, and that is not true. He actually used a scaffold system to maneuver the ceiling. The scaffold is a flat wooden platform on brackets built out from the holes in the floor. And so actually this diagram here is showing you that, in fact, Michelangelo would be standing, so he wasn't, on his back this whole time. To further emphasize the idea that Michelangelo absolutely hated this commission, painting the Sistine Chapel, I mentioned to you earlier that Michelangelo was also considered a great poet, and he wrote a sonnet in a letter. And basically, again, I'll let you sort of read it on your own. But it basically is talking about how much he hates painting and sort of being stuck in this sort of chapel and forced to paint, which took many, many years for him to complete. So the entirety of the ceiling, look at that, it's pretty magnificent, depicts 9 scenes from the book of Genesis down around the spine of the building, and they're in chronological order. So here's a diagram that really sort of breaks down these different scenes. There's also these other figures called sibyls that are sort of, and prophets that are embedded into the composition as well. But these are sort of the main scenes right here in the center along the spine that depict the story of Genesis. Something that is also interesting about the Sistine Chapel is that there was a recent cleaning in the 1980s that revealed the beautiful rich colors that had been used. Over the years, it had become very dingy from all the smoke of burning incense and candles over time. And I don't understand why art historians didn't think about this, but, the paintings were dirty and dingy, and so the textbook would write about the color, the formal design element of the color as being sort of moody and dark and mysterious, when in fact that wasn't the original color that Michaelangelo used. And so when they cleaned the ceiling, the frescoes, the textbooks had to be rewritten because obviously, the color palette that Michelangelo was using was quite different than what art historians had thought. And again, here's another diagram of how the architecture and the frescoes are arranged on the ceiling. And here's another one. So he began painting the opposite end from the entryway first. And as he worked, he sort of learned how to gauge viewpoint and perspective. And so you have to think that the viewer was looking at this from below. And so he had to paint the images much differently so that viewed from a lower level, they would look correct. And so you can sort of look at how he was figuring this out when you look at the progression of the paintings that he started. So I think the entryway is meant here. Anyway, it's probably most likely here. And so he actually started from the opposite end of the entryway to kind of practice before he got to the entryway. So he kind of perfected his technique. So when studying these frescoes, scholars have noted the figures are smaller when he first started, and he sort of had trouble with the fresco recipe as well and was trying to figure it out. So here you can see more images, and it's really quite exquisite. Michelangelo was very secretive about his work in the chapel. He was reported to have kept the doors closed most of the time. In addition to the main narrative scene, he also painted figures of alternating sibyls, which are right here, and we'll look more in detail at those. Sibyls were these female prophets, and then also these saints, which are depicted a little bit above the sibyls. He unifies the architecture by utilizing the framework and moldings around certain scenes and triangular spaces. Between the windows are large pendentives, which support the vault. And between the pendentives are triangular shaped arches or spandrels cut into the vault above each window. Above the height of the pendentives, the ceiling slopes gently without much deviation from the horizontal. This is real architecture. This is a real and this is considered the real architecture Michelangelo has elaborated it with illusionary or fictive architecture as well. So some of this is real architecture and some of this is actually faux and has been painted to sort of unify the actual architecture with the ceiling and the frescoes. Here's a detail. So in these lunettes, Michelangelo has painted illusionistic, sort of fictive, so that here you can see this sort of fictive architecture around the figures. Here you can see some more details. So here you can sort of see that all of this has been painted. And then these, I think this is the actual architecture. So here's a detail. So he also created these figures, these nude male figures called ignudi, I-G-N-U-D-I. And he used them to work out compositional ideas. So he kind of used, before he started painting the main scene, he kind of would use these sort of secondary figures on the sides, the Sibyls and the Anuti and the Saints, to sort of work out, again, compositional arrangements and figure out, get comfortable painting the figure. Notice the very complex poses that he has these figures arranged in. This is pretty dramatic. No one really sits like this, and sort of the twisting and turning. There's obviously, you've probably noted this extreme articulation of muscular structure. And so, Michelangelo really loved the male nude body, as we will see, because some of the female figures that he has depicted often look male. So again, it's and almost, he's really sort of creating these sort of action figures, or and a lot of comic book artists have looked at the work of Michelangelo because he really was sort of creating these really heroic, just bulked up, very masculine male bodies. So this ignudi is laying against some acorns, which was a symbol of hope. This is a detail of a Sibyl. Again, you can see how he's depicting the bodies in motion. They're not stagnant. Look at how this figure of a Sibyl is sort of turning on her toe and sort of using her toe to sort of help pivot. And look at that toe. That's so gorgeous, the way he's painted that. But she's sort of holding this book, and yes, it is a female, so this is what I was talking about. Even when he painted females, he really emasculated them, and again, they sort of seem like, female heads with that were sort of planted on these very buffed up male bodies. But again, that twisting and that turning, and so he's trying to show off, but he's also sort of trying to figure out these more complex compositional figurations as well. And again, note this sort of painted or faux architecture he's created. The use of color is outstanding, and usually you don't see colors like this in the Renaissance paintings. He used complementary colors opposite of each other on the color wheel. And if you're an artist, you've probably studied this before. And what's interesting about complementary colors is that they contrast and intensify each other. And so when you use complementary colors like red and green, orange and blue, it makes the colors seem more bright and vivid. And so getting back to the cleaning of, or the restoration of the Sistine Chapel, the restoration of the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel was probably one of the most significant art restorations of the 20th century. The frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, and in particular the ceiling and the accompanying lunettes by Michelangelo, have been subject to a number of restorations, the most recent taking place in the 1980s, and then again another one in 1994. The most recent restoration had a profound effect on art lovers and historians, as colors and details that had not been seen for centuries were revealed. It has been claimed that as a result, every book on Michelangelo had to be rewritten and probably rephotographed. Restorers used distilled water and weak dissolvents to remove the grime from Michelangelo's fresco. So what you're looking at is the difference. So this is what it looked like after the accumulation of all the smoke from burning incense and candles, and this is what it looked like after they cleaned it. So again, I mean, very, very different. And this is what it looked like, and here's the technique where they're sort of gradually sort of removing. They would sort of take, I think there's a video. They would sort of soak, I think or they would use this solvent, and then they would take like a sheet of paper or something and sort of it would absorb the dirt. So here you can see it's been gradually cleaned. And then, cleaned again. So again, quite remarkable in terms of the difference in color. So here's another one that was cleaned. So this is what it looked like before the restoration, and then this is what it looked like after. So again, a remarkable difference. And again, this color palette was unusual for the High Renaissance, and it's quite beautiful and innovative. Also, the pictures are very charming. Here you have this depiction of one of the saints, and he's been woken up by one of these little angels, or putti, P-U-T-T-I. It's quite charming and cute. Here's another depiction of one of the sibyls. Again, these were female prophets. And again, you really can see they look like men. I mean, look at how bulky that arm is. So women were depicted with very masculine bodies. And again, remember, he was using these figures of the sibyls and the prophets and the ignudi, the nude males, to solve compositional and perspective issues in his main composition of depicting the story of Genesis. And you really can see, so the reason why I went over his sculpture in such great detail was, I mean, he really loved, I think sculpture was his first medium. I mean, he really loved that medium, and I think you really can see how he translates that sort of bulk and massive, these sort of heroic figures and this male anatomy, and really translates it in his painting as well. And you can really sense that the same artist created both of these. This is an image that is that you do have to know. It's listed in your book, in your 250 works that you have to know for the AP exam. This is called the Delphic Sibyl. It's probably one of the more beautiful and youthful of the Sibyls that he depicted on the Sistine Chapel. The Sibyls were female seers from antiquity who were thought to have predicted the coming of Christ, and this Sibyl appears startled as she turns her head away from her prophetic scroll and gazes into the future. The Delphic Sibyl was the voice of Apollo, the Greek god of music, poetry, prophecy, and medicine, and it has been suggested that the 4 colors in her garments represent earth, water, fire, and air, the basic elements of life. So here, this one definitely, I think, looks even, not as masculine. She definitely looks more feminine compared to some of these other Sibyls that he's depicted. All right, I'm going to stop here. We do have a few more areas of the Sistine Chapel to look at and talk about. So there will be a part 2 for our segment on Michelangelo. So stay tuned. Oh, and again, I wanted to remind you of the videos from Khan Academy that are located in your resource folder. You really should be looking at those as well, and in addition to watching my lectures, and hopefully, reading your textbook. I know some of you hate reading your textbook, and that's why I do these online lectures too, just because I know some people, don't like to read. So, but anyway, you should try to read your textbook. All right, so thanks for listening. Take care.